I like this. A podium that goes up and down. Don't always get this. Go down a little bit. I am delighted to be here. And I'd never been to Ashland University before. Of course, I'd heard about the Ashbrook Center and have known Cliff White for many years. And, of course, his career in politics is certainly an illustrious one going back many, many years. I'm sorry he couldn't be here, but I certainly wish him well in his recovery to good health. But I am delighted to be here. Actually, I've had this talk on my schedule for many, many months. And I thought maybe at one point I wasn't going to be able to come, but it worked out perfectly, and I am delighted to be here, even though I have to go back to Washington this afternoon and do a television show tonight, but I'm sure glad I could get here. You know, people from Washington, as Lynn Nofziger is too now, he's in Washington, and Ed Rollins is, who you've had speak here before, don't always get a great reception around the country. Washington is not America's most popular city, as I'm sure you know. And the result of that is that people give you sort of the fisheye sometime when you say you're from Washington, and yet I try to explain to them that I've lived in Washington my whole life. I grew up there, still live there in a suburb in Virginia, right outside the city. You know, it takes me less than 10 minutes to get to work in town. And I try to explain to people that Washington is a city just like any other city. It really has the same sort of problems and good points that any metropolitan area has. For instance, Washington has a crime problem. Crime in Washington is up 26% this year. And that's just in the House of Representatives. The introductions you get outside Washington sometimes are not so great too, but they're usually better than the way I was referred to on one of the Saturday Night Live spoofs of the McLaughlin Group. They've done about 4 or 5 of them, and I'm referred to on those shows as Freddy Krueger. People ask me about the McLaughlin Group when I give speeches. People from outside Washington, they watch it on television, and they particularly ask me about John McLaughlin, who's a former Jesuit priest, and now gives every evidence of having been a Jesuit, none of having been a priest. But they ask me, what's John McLaughlin really like? And I say he's just like he appears on Saturday Night Live. He's overbearing, abrasive, abusive, pedantic. A day without McLaughlin is like a day without hemorrhoids. In fact, in measuring John McLaughlin's ego, I finally came to the conclusion that John McLaughlin has the 3rd biggest ego in America. Obviously, the biggest ego is Ross Perot. And the second is Henry Kissinger, who is now writing a book, Famous Men Who've Known Me. But John's right up there, number 3, and pushing hard to get higher. The guiding principle of the McLaughlin Group is really very simple. If you don't have anything nice to say, let's hear it. So with that in mind, I'll tell you the best political story that I've heard in the last several years. And it involves the famous desks on the floor of the Senate. I'll bet practically everyone here has been to Washington. You get a chance to go into the gallery of the Senate and sit there for about 15 minutes, and on a hectic day of a really busy day in the Senate, there'll be sometimes 3, 4, 5 senators on the floor. Well, this day, there were 3 senators on the floor, and they began discussing the famous desks on the floor of the Senate. Obviously, there are 100 desks. Some of them are 100 years old, 150 years old, very old desks. And there's a tradition whereby senators actually inscribe in the wood something on the desk. So a senator who comes many, many years later will know who sat there years before. Well, on this day, 3 senators, idle moment on the Senate floor, discussed their desks. That subject came up, and Terry Sanford of North Carolina said how thrilled he was to have the desk that used to belong to Daniel Webster. And on it was inscribed a famous thing from one of Daniel Webster's speeches, one nation now and forever, something like that. And then Weiss Fowler of Georgia jumped in and said, wait a minute, I have a desk that's extraordinarily historic too. It used to belong to Henry Clay, and on it is inscribed the most famous thing Henry Clay ever said. I'd rather be right than president. Well, at this point, Tom Daschle of South Dakota hadn't said a word, kind of chuckled and jumped in and said, "Wait a minute, I can top both of you guys. I have Gary Hart's old desk." And on it is inscribed, "For a good time, call 224." The guy who told me that story swears it's true, but I have not gone down to the Senate floor to check out that old desk. I've covered every presidential campaign since 1976, and the one this year is easily the most unusual, an extraordinarily unusual election in many, many ways. For instance, this year, this was a presidential election year in which Teddy Kennedy was happily married, and George Bush was accused of fooling around. It was a year in which the 800 number became a very big part of politics. 800 number. Remember Jerry Brown asking people to dial his 800 number and send in $100? That was the maximum he'd accept in a campaign contribution. Then Ross Perot came along and said, "Dial 1-800-PEROT and I'll send you $100. And finally, there was one very unusual event that I noticed just a few weeks ago, before Election Day, in which, actually, it was during the entire campaign, when late-night talk show hosts would involve themselves in the campaign. Remember when Arsenio Hall invited Bill Clinton to come on and play the saxophone? That was back in June. After that, Arsenio Hall was very, very critical of Bush and Quayle, and Ross Perot loved Clinton. And Jay Leno got into the act. And after the second debate, which was the vice presidential debate, Jay Leno did a very unusual thing. He said that Dan Quayle had been wrong in something that Quayle said during the debate with Al Gore and James Stockdale. And Quayle had said that the three words that Bill Clinton fears the most are telling the truth. And Jay Leno said, "That's not right. Those are not the three words that Bill Clinton remembers the most." In fact, Jay Leno said the three words that Bill Clinton fears the most are, "Hi, remember me?" Here's what I'm going to talk about marginally more seriously today. And the main one is why Clinton won and George Bush lost. And secondly, a little about the shape of the Clinton presidency, about which we know surprisingly little. The last time there was a transition from one party to the other in the White House, it was very different. There, when Ronald Reagan was coming in at this point in 1980, we knew for certain the general direction of his administration. Now, we didn't know the precise legislation he was going to propose, exactly what the tax cut would look like, and exactly what the spending cuts would look like, but we knew the general direction of his administration. It was going to go in a very conservative direction, and it did. With Bill Clinton, it's just the opposite. We know some of the specifics. He's in favor of raising the top rate from 31 to 36%, and he's going to reduce the White House staff by 25%, even though the staff won't get smaller. They'll just bring employees in from other federal agencies. So on, we know all these specifics, but we don't know, at least I don't, the general direction of his administration. It could be in a very liberal direction, could be in a more centrist direction along the lines of the way he campaigned. But I'll get back to that in a minute. I think politics, and I hate to tell some of the political science professors here, I never took a political science course, although I recommend them. My daughter took some in college. Politics is really common sense. It's not that hard to figure out. It's not mysterious. There's no secret brotherhood or sisterhood that knows the keys to understanding politics. It's something that most people can understand and scope out very, very well. And whether consciously or intuitively, voters understand things in a way that many times political experts don't. I think there are basically three broad reasons why George Bush lost and Bill Clinton won, and they are actually fairly obvious reasons. I have a wrinkle or two on them, but they're fairly obvious reasons. The economy. The economy was, under Bush, not as good as it was under Ronald Reagan. Wasn't that bad. 6 straight quarters of growth, but in the economy, but certainly job growth did not go along with that because it was not a strong growth in the economy. We have low interest rates and low inflation and an export boom. Detroit, at least parts of it, are recovering a little bit. And so the economy's not that bad. So it wasn't just the economy per se that was Bush's problem. If it were simply the economy, Bush would have gotten reelected. It was something else related to the economy that hurt him so much. And I think it's this. Bush's problem was that he could not generate confidence among people that he would bring prosperity in his second term. He had slow growth in his first, a recession, then slow growth. He could not generate this confidence that he was the answer to creating a prosperity, that he could thus ease the feelings that people have of job insecurity, for instance. He never could do that. There was one question in particular that exemplified this, a question asked day after day by George Bush's campaign pollster, Fred Steeper, from up in Detroit, a great pollster, very honest man. And he would ask the question in his national polling, do you believe that George Bush has a credible plan for the economy? And he asked that in June, and he asked it in July, and August, and September, and October. And the answer was, always came back, well under 50% of the people believe, well, only about a third at most believed that Bush had a credible plan for the economy, and that number never changed. No matter what Bush did, that number never changed. People did not believe he had a credible plan for the economy. Now, I believe he did have a credible plan for the economy. He was very late in spelling it out. He didn't do it until mid-September in his speech to the Detroit Economic Club. And it involved tax cuts, spending cuts, legal reform, basically shoot the trial lawyers, deregulation, a cap on entitlement spending, a freeze on domestic discretionary spending, and so on. It was a credible plan for the economy. But Bush did have a hard sell because it was a plan for the economy that he hadn't followed in his first term. So he needed to convince voters that, well, my first term I did one thing, I signed that budget deal, that was a mistake, but I'm going to be different in my second term. And he couldn't sell voters on that. One of the reasons was he didn't do what Jim Baker always said had to be done in successful presidential campaigns. And Baker said this in '84, and he said it in '88 as well. '84 when he was the White House Chief of Staff running Reagan's re-election, '88 running Bush's campaign. And he said, what you do in presidential campaigns is you get a couple of themes, and there's repetition, repetition, and repetition, which is what Bush needed to do on his economic plan, and which, under Jim Baker's direction this year, he did not do. At his speech in Detroit, a couple of more speeches about his economic plan, and then went on to other things. A couple of friends of mine, one a White House speechwriter and the other at the campaign, kept track of how many different themes Bush had during the campaign. And by the end of the summer, they were up to 9. By mid-October, they were up to 15. Imagine how confused voters were when there was no central 2 or 3 themes from the Bush campaign. 15 themes, and on election day, they were still counting. So I don't know how high it got. The difference was Bill Clinton had a plan. I think it's a bad plan. The numbers don't add up. It's one of the reasons he's having an economic summit, because his numbers don't add up. He's got a plan to raise $45 billion in tougher enforcement of taxation of foreign companies. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that will only raise about $1.5 billion rather than $45 billion. So his numbers are screwy. His economic growth number doesn't work. All his numbers don't work. But it's a plan that he's been talking about all year and repeating over and over again. He's taken Jim Baker's advice that Bush and Baker did not follow this year. And Clinton also was optimistic about his plan and what it would do for America. Now, I'm not optimistic about what his plan will do, but when a politician, particularly running at the presidential level, exudes optimism and faith in the country, voters are attracted to that. It was one of the things that was so attractive about Ronald Reagan. It was one of the things that was so attractive about Franklin Roosevelt. It was one of the reasons why Ronald Reagan liked Franklin Roosevelt so much, because they were very similar, just exuding this optimism, this great spirit. And Bill Clinton had a little of that. George Bush didn't. He was a little bit more in the Jimmy Carter mold. Not quite that downbeat, but something along that line. Now, the reason you needed to exude optimism, even more so in this election, because of this wave of pessimism of a particular kind that had swept across the country. And it wasn't pessimism of people that people felt about their own lives, quite the contrary. A poll was done, a national poll for a piece I did in Reader's Digest, asking people about their optimism about their own lives, and they were asked to judge their lives on what Richard Worthland, the pollster, Ronald Reagan's old pollster, but he did this poll, to judge their lives on something he calls the ladder of life. And you pick between 1 and 10, sounds like the McLaughlin group, but you pick between 1 and 10 in terms of optimism or pessimism, where you were 5 years ago, where you are now, and where you think you'll be in 5 years. Now, he's been doing national polls with this ladder of life for about 20 years, and he found that today, people are more optimistic about their own lives and where they'll be in 5 years than they have ever been. And the most optimistic group of all are black married couples. This was a very huge sample on this poll for Reader's Digest, so you could break it down to groups like that. Americans are extraordinarily optimistic about their own lives, but they're very pessimistic about the country. There's a remarkable dichotomy there. And you ask the question, another one that Worthland started years ago and is now routinely asked by pollsters, do you think the country is going in the right direction, or has the country gotten off on the wrong track? And now, for more than a year, 70% plus of the American people say the country's gotten off on the wrong track. Very pessimistic about the country. Well, it's a peculiar type of pessimism because there are so many reasons to be optimistic about the country, and yet people are pessimistic. I mean, the economy's not that bad. We won the Cold War, one of the remarkable achievements in human history. We don't have to worry about nuclear terror from the Soviet Union anymore, and I'm old enough to have been involved in those practice sessions in the classroom that I'll bet many of you all had when you climbed under your desk to practice for what you do if there were an air raid. We won Desert Storm. The U.S. is the lone superpower in the world. As I say, the economy is not that bad, even after the United States absorbed one of the greatest immigrant influxes in human history over the last 10 or 12 years, and yet people are extraordinarily pessimistic. Remarkable. The second reason, after the economy and the various permutations on the economy, I think, is something I call the Churchill effect. If you read the New Republic, you will have read my article, perhaps, about the Churchill effect. And the Churchill effect is based on the experience of Winston Churchill in 1945. And some of you all will remember or have read about what happened to Churchill that year. He lost 11 weeks after World War II ended. He was voted out of office in one of the greatest Labor Party landslides of the 20th century. This great, inspiring, courageous, wartime hero of England voted out of office 11 weeks after World War II. Now, why was that? And the reason was the Tories, the Conservative Party, Churchill's party, had no plan for England, no plan for the economy. They talked in vague terms, but they talked a lot about the war and what they'd done then. They were running, Churchill was running for re-election as a wartime president, as a wartime prime minister, and it didn't work. The Labor Party had a very detailed 5-year plan for social and economic reform. That's what they talked about, they concentrated on, they forgot about the war, and they were elected. They ruined England as a result, but and really embedded socialism in England, but that's another story. They won. Churchill was, and the Tories came back, I believe, in 1951, but it was too late to really save England from itself. But Churchill lost in a landslide. The wartime leader was rejected. The same thing happened here. The Cold War ended, and voters intuitively understood that they could take risks that they never would have taken before. Risks they weren't about to take in 1988. and particularly after seeing the one ad that was by far the best ad, one of the best ads I've ever seen in a presidential race, was the one in 1988 in which Mike Dukakis was shown in that tank. Remember that one? That ridiculous hat on. And there was a scroll across the screen of all these names of these weapons programs that Mike Dukakis opposed. In fact, he didn't even oppose all of them, but that wasn't the point. The point was to mock the idea of Mike Dukakis as commander-in-chief. And that ad worked famously. Hard to think of Mike Dukakis as commander-in-chief. Now, that ad would not have worked this year. I didn't mean to speak so loud that I knocked the table over, but because people were not looking for a commander-in-chief. They were not looking for a wartime president. They were not looking for an international crisis manager. George Bush is a great international crisis manager. You know, in the exit polls, only 8% of the people said that foreign policy was a major issue in their selection of who they voted for, whether it was Bush, Clinton, or Perot. 8%, very, very low. And yet Bush, when you saw him campaigning, and I went around with him some, was running for commander-in-chief. At many of his campaign appearances, and maybe here in Ohio too, he was accompanied by Major Dad, you know, the guy from the TV show. A wonderful guy, but not really what you needed in this race. And Bush talked a lot about being commander-in-chief. He talked a lot about who do you want when we're going to have an international crisis. He talked about classic Cold War issues, the draft, anti-war demonstrations, and so on, and yet not many people were listening. They were looking for something different. They knew they didn't need a crisis manager anymore, and so they could take a risk and go for Clinton. And they did. The last reason is another one that is fairly obvious. And anybody who's written about politics or even thought about politics in the last 20 years knows what the Democrats had to do to win the White House. It was very, very simple. Move to the center. A liberal can't get elected president of the United States in this day and age. Now, Bill, maybe underneath it, Bill Clinton is a liberal, though I really don't think he is. I think of him more as a charming opportunist of no fixed ideology. But he campaigned as a moderate. He said, I'm not a liberal, not a conservative either. I have a third way. It's down the middle. And one example of this, I recall from the Democratic Convention, was seeing a placard that stuck in my mind. Guy carrying a placard that said, Gay and Lesbian Animal Rights Coalition. And what was striking about it was that this was carried by a protester outside Madison Square Garden where the convention was taking place, not by a delegate inside. It would have been a delegate in 88 or 84 or 80, but it was somebody outside protesting. Bill Clinton managed to get to the right politically of George Bush on some foreign policy issues. China, Bosnia, encouraging democracy around the world. A very deft move by Bill Clinton. And on some domestic issues, he got to the right of him. Welfare, cutting off welfare recipients after 2 years. That's what he promises. Whether he'll do that or not, don't hold your breath. But that's what he said. 100,000 more cops around the country. We need them. That's what he was promising. Bush wasn't. Did he cut the White House staff? I always laugh when I hear that. As I was telling some people earlier today, my daughter works on the White House staff. She graduated from college and was offered a job at the 1,000 Points of Light program. I didn't arrange it. But she took it, and I saw her first paycheck when it came in, and it was from some Defense Department agency, whose name I don't even remember. And she's a typical White House employee. She's not not listed on the White House staff, but she works there. And when somebody says they're going to reduce the White House staff by 25%, sure, they'll reduce the official White House staff by 25%, and then all the detailees from other departments will go up. So be a little dubious when you hear that, as I suppose most of you are anyway. And then Bill Clinton did one other thing that won him lots of votes or respectability among the kind of people who have not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate probably since Lyndon Johnson in '64. Maybe some of them voted for Humphrey. But he zinged Jesse Jackson. I happened to go to that speech in Washington where he where he raised the question of Sister Souljah having been invited to speak at that same meeting the night before. And now the Wall Street Journal uses Sister Souljah as a verb in saying, you know, you Sister Souljah someone, as Bill Clinton did to Jesse Jackson. And it showed what a lot of people, Reagan Democrats in particular, a lot of moderate voters wanted to see, that he would not kowtow to Jesse Jackson, and that was a very, very important moment in the campaign. Of course, Bill Clinton was smart. He knew he could get away with it. Jesse Jackson was not running. Jesse Jackson didn't have 1,800 delegates. It would have been very different if Jackson had run and had a third of the delegates at the convention. Then Bill Clinton wouldn't have been doing that. But he knew he was free to do it, and he did it, and it helped. And by moving in this centrist direction, when he came out with his liberal tax and spend economic plan, he was somewhat inoculated. I mean, he proposed $150 billion in tax increases and $220 billion in new spending, including $80 billion to be funneled through the most corrupt and inefficient political systems in our country, administrations run by mayors across the country of the big cities. And yet, he was able, because he had taken so many moderate stands, he was able to avoid the stigma, though Bush tried to stick it to him, of being a tax and spend liberal. Now let me speak briefly about the Clinton presidency, because we really do know so little about it. Clinton has an economic plan. Now he's calling an economic summit to find out what his economic plan is. And as I said, it's very unlike when Ronald Reagan came in. You had confidence about the direction Ronald Reagan would go, and I was all for it. I'm not convinced that Bill Clinton is going to veer off in a liberal direction, though there will be extraordinary pressure on him to head that way. But we may find out very soon when he names his economic team. Now, one of the people he's been talking to recently is Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve. If he named Paul Volcker a Treasury Secretary, a hawk on reducing the deficit, that would probably be a very good sign for a Democratic administration. It would soothe financial markets not only here, but around the world, and that's important. We have a globalized economy. We know that the economic events in other countries can dramatically affect the United States. John Major has learned that in England. When the Germans maintained high interest rates, the British economy collapsed, and the pound collapsed. Here, we know just from what Bill Clinton said a few weeks before Election Day about perhaps having an economic stimulus package, and that alarmed bondholders around the world who hold many Treasury bonds in particular, but other bonds in the United States. They reacted unfavorably, and long-term interest rates went up. I hope Bill Clinton learned a lesson from that, because the global markets are probably what will provide the greatest discipline on Bill Clinton's economic plan. So if Paul Volcker or Lloyd Bentsen, the senator from Texas, become Treasury Secretary, that's a good sign. If someone like Felix Rohatyn of New York City, an investment banker and an industrial policy fanatic, does, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble. It'll mean that there is a liberal direction that we're heading in. Clinton basically has three agendas. He's got the quickie agenda, where he can sign some of these executive orders, and they can be a problem for him, because the ones his staff has talked about his signing on January 20th when he comes in, 4 involve abortion, allowing the French abortion pill to be imported, allowing abortions at military hospitals, lifting the so-called gag rule on abortion at federally funded family planning clinics, and the 4th one will come to me in a minute. I can't think of it right now. More important, there's one where he's said he would sign an executive order lifting the ban on homosexuals in the military. Now that is a very controversial one, but then so are the abortion ones. And the reason they're a problem for Clinton is they will appease liberals in his party, but they threaten his governing coalition, which is a very fragile governing coalition. Did the microphone go off?
Yeah, I think you stuck on
How's that? It's my fault. I knocked the plug down here. Obviously, he got 43% of the vote. It is kind of a very slimmed down New Deal coalition, where not that many white Southerners in it, but he's gotten Reagan Democrats, ethnic Catholics from the North, and he cut a little bit into the evangelical vote, mainly in the South and so on, but it is a very fragile coalition that could be easily upset by his signing executive orders on things like gay rights and abortion, and then not be there when he needs it when he gets to his second agenda, which is the main one he talked about in the campaign. His economic plan, as bad as it is, his education plan, and his health care plan, whichever one he winds up with. The health care plan, he's on his third so far, so I'm not sure where he'll go, but he is heading in the right direction. As he's gone along, they have become slightly less bureaucratic, though only slightly. Those are the things that are important to him and not these other things. So he risks breaking up his governing coalition before it's had a chance to do any work. Believe me, lifting the ban on gays in the military would be extraordinarily controversial. It's not just that the military is against it. Most Americans are against it, but the military is also a powerful political force in this country. Not that they're going to stage a coup, but they have clout on Capitol Hill. They have a lot of clout around the country. That one could be a big problem for him. So he gets to his 100 days agenda. He'll raise taxes. I mean, he said he'd raise the top rate from 31 to 36%, have a surtax on millionaires, a job training tax, try to tax foreign companies and so on. That's not going to kind of raise the kind of revenue he wants, and then he's going to have to decide what to do. Am I going to raise more revenue, and if so, how am I going to do it? And then we'll find out whether he'll tax the middle class or not. Now, he said, I will not tax the middle class. Right now, he says he's only going to raise the taxes on people making over $200,000. But his press secretary, George Stephanopoulos, says, according to the Clinton campaign, the middle class begins at $50,000 and below. So between $50,000 and $200,000, there are a lot of Americans and there's a lot of money. And that may be the area that he goes after if he wants to raise more taxes. And if he's going to do anything like the spending that he's talked about during the campaign, it would be a lot more than $220 million. Clinton throws out ideas like drug treatment on demand, which would cost billions. He's going to have to raise revenue someplace. But it's the longer-term agenda that is the problem for Clinton. And it's a problem for this reason. There is, in Washington, among liberal special interest groups and Democratic members of Congress, an extraordinary pent-up demand to spend and regulate and bureaucratize in a way that we haven't seen in America. Now, these people believe that the last 12 years, the Reagan and Bush years, even though federal spending doubled, they believe these were years of incredible austerity. And Robert Byrd, the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and many, many others on Capitol Hill have piles of legislation they would like to pass to spend more, to build more, to have more pork barrel and everything. And my view is that if Bill Clinton is going to have a successful presidency, he's going to have to say no. And he's going to have to say no over and over and over again to the most powerful bloc in his party. It's going to be hard to say no to them. It's like George Bush saying no to the conservatives in his party, the most powerful bloc. It will get him in trouble, but it can also save his presidency, because if he spends and spends and spends and raises taxes, the economy will suffer, interest rates will go up, we'll have higher inflation, the deficit will get bigger, and the economy will stutter and stumble and probably go into recession. And if that happens, Clinton will be in great trouble. Now, here's what he doesn't understand. Clinton has never experienced the kind of pressure that will now be upon him from the left wing of his party. Certainly there is not a lot of strong liberal influence in Arkansas. So he didn't have that as governor, therefore was able to govern as a moderate. And amazingly, he didn't have much in the presidential race. Normally, moderates running for the Democratic presidential nomination, and it happened in 84 and 88, are dragged to the left, because that's where the stronger candidates are. They can't let Jesse Jackson or Walter Mondale out-appeal them on the left because they see how the liberal activists are responding, and they're the most visible people in the Democratic presidential primary electorate. So they're dragged to the left. But Bill Clinton wasn't this year, because there was no strong candidate on the left. Jesse Jackson wasn't running. I mean, you had Jerry Brown, for heaven's sakes, not a guy that is going to attract a lot of voters, and Tom Harkin, who repelled voters. So Clinton basically got a free ride ideologically, no more. The liberals and the left of the Democratic Party both swallowed hard and accepted Clinton, and now they want to be paid back. They think they've suffered for 12 years. They have a Democrat in office. They want their people appointed. They want their programs enacted. They want their spending spent. And Bill Clinton has not experienced the kind of pressure that he's going to get. It started on November 4th to respond to the interest groups that the Democrats have and to Democrats on Capitol Hill. We'll see what happens. I'm not optimistic. Let me finish by, and then I'm happy to take questions and chat with people after that even. Let me tell you about the person that I miss the most in American politics, and that's Ronald Reagan. And I miss him for two reasons. One, I think Ronald Reagan will be remembered as a great president, one who changed the direction of the country, one who, when historians look back on the Reagan presidency, will be amazed at the contemporary journalistic accounts of his presidency, and they will wonder how all these journalists and reporters writing back then couldn't see the forest for the trees. But Reagan was interesting for reasons other than that. Reagan was the greatest political speaker I've ever heard. We were reminded of that at the Republican convention in Houston when Reagan gave that speech very late at night, and at the beginning I didn't think he was going to be able to make it. He's up in his 80s now, but once he got rolling, he was tremendous. And even with that line about Thomas Jefferson, you knew exactly what the punchline was, and yet I've seen the tape of it about 6 or 8 times, and it's funnier every time. It's amazing. Only Ronald Reagan could tell some obvious joke and make it be the most hilarious thing that happened at the entire convention. Reagan gave speeches that mattered. He cared about his speeches. Jim Lake, who was his press secretary in 76 and 80, told me once that Ronald Reagan got mad at him one time. One time. It was in 1980. They were on the campaign plane, about to land, I believe in Knoxville, Tennessee. They're about 10 minutes out. And Jim Lake wanted to raise a question with Reagan about something, so he went into the compartment where Reagan was and said, "Governor Reagan, I need to ask you something." And he said, Reagan blew up and said, "Look, you got to go. Can't you see I'm working on my speech? Now, I can't answer you now. Now, get out of here." And he said he went out and shut the door behind him or left Reagan alone, and he said it dawned on him, here's Reagan in there working on this speech that he's given 10,000 times before. The same speech, basically, but yet Reagan cared so much about it, knew it was so important, that he was manicuring it and fine-tuning it for this audience in Knoxville, Tennessee. The speech mattered. And Reagan gave ones that were one of the best pieces of reading, if you ever want to get, so far, the best book from the Reagan presidency is the collection of Reagan speeches. They're tremendous. I attended many of them, and they read even better than they were when he gave them, and they were pretty good then. Particularly the one at Moscow State University, one of the greatest statements in favor of freedom and democracy and capitalism ever given. Reagan gave a lot of terrific speeches. But here's what I'm leading up to. Reagan also filled his speeches with stories and anecdotes and fables and parables and things that made his speeches interesting and riveting. You remember parts of his speeches, the stories he told. Remember the State of the Union addresses where he would point to somebody up in the gallery at the House of Representatives and say, somebody, a boat person from Vietnam who was now graduating from West Point and so on. He really brought a human dimension to his speeches. By far the best I've ever heard, and I've wondered why other politicians don't emulate it. But perhaps they realize that when they try, it doesn't work. Remember Phil Gramm trying to stick stories in his speech at the Republican convention. He bombed. Reagan, in his last few years, filled his speeches with stories about life under communism. Stories, he said, the Russian people were telling each other about cynical stories about how terrible life was under communism. Now, Reagan never explained how these stories had come to him, but he said they had. And I'll accept that. And I probably heard him tell a dozen or so of these stories in the last couple of years that he was in the presidency. In fact, he told one of them to Mikhail Gorbachev when they had their first summit meeting in Geneva in 1985. But here's my favorite one. And it involves a guy who lived in Moscow whose wife sends him out to get a loaf of bread. So he heads down to the grocery store. huge line, stands in line, hour after hour after hour after hour, and finally he can't take it anymore. The line's not moving, he hasn't gotten a loaf of bread, and he explodes and starts denouncing communism, saying it's a terrible system, it's inefficient, it's dictatorial, it's unfair, it crushes the human spirit, it's imperialistic, it's atheistic, it's terrible, we got to get rid of it, it's awful. And finally, as he's ranting and raving, a guy steps out from the shadows, a fellow wearing a trench coat, saying, "Sir, would you come here?" And a chill goes down his spine, but he goes over to the guy in the trench coat, and the fellow in the trench coat says, "You know, in the old days, you would have been liquidated instantly. But now, under Chairman Gorbachev, we have perestroika and glasnost, and things are different now. I'm going to let you off with a warning. Now, you go home. I don't want you to be denouncing our system of government again. We can't have this, but I'm going to allow you to go on home. Now, take off." And the guy goes, whew, heads home, goes in the door at home, and his wife said, "Well, did you get the loaf of bread?" And he says, "Well, dear, as it turns out, conditions in this country are worse than you or I ever imagined." He said, "Not only did I not get the loaf of bread, but they're out of bullets now." I'll tell you one more. Also from Ronald Reagan. The guy orders a car in Moscow, calls up the state-run auto agency and says, "I want to order a new ZIL." About 2 weeks later, he gets a call back from the guy at the state-run auto agency who says, "It's your lucky day. Your order's been accepted. You can come pick up your new car April 21st, 1997. The guy says, "That's fantastic. Should I come in the morning or the afternoon?" The guy at the auto agency says, "The morning or the afternoon? What difference could that possibly make?" And the guy says, "Well, the plumber's coming in the morning." Thank you very much. Well, it failed this time. The question is about a balanced budget amendment. Why did it fail, and will it be taken up again? In the first place, I'm not in favor of it, particularly the one that might pass, because what it would do would cause some rather large tax increases. Now, there are ways, if you had the one that Bob Caston proposed and others proposed, you could have one that would not require a lot of tax increases, but that one was never going to get out this year. What happened this year, you had in the House of Representatives, you had a majority in favor of a balanced budget amendment, and it was going to pass. And finally, Speaker Foley and other Democratic leaders went around to Democrats in the House and got a number of them who had endorsed the amendment, signed publicly in favor of it, to vote against it. And they did, and so it never got out. Bill Clinton's against it, so I think for all intents and purposes, for the next 4 years, it's dead. The other question that's along that line is the line item veto. Now, Bill Clinton is for a line item veto nominally. It's in his economic package, but I see that he has already decided that, well, I'm not going to ask for a line item veto quickly. I'll wait around. If he doesn't ask, he's probably not going to get it anyway, but if he didn't ask for it right away at the peak of his popularity and power, he'll never get it. I think he was never serious about it anyway. It was just a rhetorical point he could make to sound more centrist. But I sure wish a president would get it. Yeah. Well, almost all of them he'll sign. He'll sign the Freedom of Choice Act. The question on the Freedom of Choice Act, which would allow abortion on demand, is that Bill Clinton has said in the campaign he wanted 2 exceptions, one for parental consent, one for a waiting period, as enacted in Pennsylvania and other states. Now, I'm not sure we'll see whether he really requires that if he sent a Freedom of Choice Act that doesn't have those in there, that just flat abortion on demand across the country. We'll see. So that was just one of many, and I've been wrong before. Of course, I never will be again. But on that one, the way it worked out was the 2 people who were there, who were for Bush, myself and John McLaughlin, we both predicted Bush, and the other 3, basically the Bush haters, all picked Clinton. So that is the way it worked out. However, in my defense, up to Friday, and we did this show Friday afternoon, up to Friday, Bush was clearly surging. And I bet you could feel it in Ohio as well. And what happened on Friday? What happened on Friday was the special prosecutor added a second indictment to Caspar Weinberger and picked out of all the notes that he could have used, written by Weinberger years ago as defense secretary, of all the notes, the hundreds of notes he could have used in this count as the example of what Weinberger had done, he picked out one involving George Bush and Iran-Contra. And well, the whole thing was about Iran contra, but one involving George Bush. Most of them had nothing to do with George Bush. He had to pick one out on purpose involving George Bush, and he could have sealed the indictment. He didn't have to have a public indictment, and that issue took over the campaign for the next 2 days and stopped Bush's surge in its tracks. Now look, looking back now, I don't think Bush would have won anyway. But it looked like he had a chance. And I said, look, he's got a chance, I might as well predict it, what the heck. And I really did think he had a chance, but later on, but that dirty trick on the part of the special prosecutor, a dirty trick that the press outside of the Wall Street Journal has had no interest in, really did have a dramatic effect on the campaign, as was shown, as Fred Steeper, the Bush quail pollster, discovered immediately. It just stopped it in the tracks because it changed the campaign. There was a good thing, I hate to prolong this answer, but there was a good thing from a Republican standpoint that happened as a result of the press declaring a month out that it was over. It made people think about a Clinton presidency. That was the best thing that happened to Bush during the whole campaign, because then people started worrying about that, moving back to Bush, and then when that Friday before the election, when this memo came out and this indictment, then that threw the spotlight back on Bush, and people remembered a lot of them remembered why they didn't like him in the first place. So it really hurt badly. Well, I'd call it both. The question was about the press and the coverage. What about it? I would call it both abnormal and bad for this reason. One, look, people in journalism now don't even argue that the press wasn't pro-Clinton, clearly pro-Clinton from late winter on. Now all they do is argue, well, give justifications for it being so pro-Clinton. You know, we were too tough on him about Jennifer Flowers, Bush deserves rougher treatment, and so on. I mean, it really was outrageous, and I think a line was crossed when reporters openly acknowledge that they were pro-Clinton and that the press in general was pro-Clinton, because even though we all know that most reporters are liberal, they don't generally like Republicans, but just the fact that they had to pretend that they were fair had a restraining influence on them. Now they don't seem to have that restraint anymore at all, and who knows what will happen.